we have a group of developed Western nations, OECD countries basically, and many of them are represented in the room here as part of the Diversities project. I want to compare some basic measures of income inequality, poverty, the role of government, and through that talk a little bit about how similar and different these countries are, because there's lots of assumptions about how similar they are, and in some ways they are, but they're also very different. The second then, I'll drill down deeper with an example from Toronto, because the first part of what I'm talking about is, you call it social change in effect. It's not geographic yet, it's about a nation, but not where it lives in effect, those changes within the nation. There you drill down in a city, let's say, and look at census tracts and how they've changed over a long period of time. So I'll show you how Toronto has been changing over time in that way. And finally, what is causing these things, and then frankly, what can be done about that, or what should be done about it. And I look forward to some good discussion. I think we'll have plenty of time for that. I have a large funded project, which Ronald Van Kempen was a key advisor in designing with us. He came to Toronto a couple of times to help us devise that, and we have funding from the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada over 7 years to study. First it was a project in Toronto only, and now it's in 6 Canadian cities, and with some international comparisons. So we've already working on Chicago. Chicago's the same size roughly as Toronto, and we want to have a couple cities someplace in Europe to compare eventually. And then our project was mentioned in the funding proposal for Diversities here. So the two projects overlap and are linked in that way. So first, a look at some comparisons. There's lots of literature, academic literature, that last 10 or 15 years has been talking about convergence among certain developed economies. And now there's more questioning of that, because it's easy to generalize, it's easy to overgeneralize. I study housing systems in detail, and if those of you who study housing systems know how different, say, a Germany is, even from Denmark or France, and let alone Canada or the United States, how we house people, whether it's owning, renting, and but the assertion of those who are now saying that there, in fact, is a great deal of divergence, and we really need to understand that, is that at both macro policy levels and down at the lived reality level and municipal level in neighborhoods, differences among countries across many different sectors means they pursue distinctly different strategies on major public policy issues. And I suspect that is also absolutely true for diversity measures. And these then affect the institutional variations across nations. When we look at different nations, they do things differently. Key features of the social solidarity within a nation, and strategic interactions among people and institutions, how one interacts as groups or as individuals. And there are many key features. I'm focusing on just a couple, but we do know that income inequality is a major issue of our time. Long before Occupy talked about the 1%, we all knew something like that was happening, and now more of us are convinced it is the defining issue, frankly, of the growing inequality, not in all countries, but in most countries, that has been taking place over the last 20 years. But countries then differ, as I'll show you shortly, in terms of income distribution. They differ in levels of social protection, and they differ in availability of collective goods. So there's a few measures of this, and I'll jump right now into a few bar graphs. And so here we have, I think it's 25 OECD nations. In orange are the diversities nations. And the Gini coefficient is a measure of income inequality, a standard measure. The smaller the bar graph here, the closer to 0, the more equal the society. 0 would be total equality. 1 would be total inequality. One person has all income. It's that kind of a measure. And so you see right off the bat, A number of countries you might expect are near the top there, at the top: Denmark, Norway, Belgium. Australia's up there, which I don't fully understand. You'll see some other measures relating to Australia. And then see, any slight change in that is a very big change in inequality. And right down to the United States, near the bottom, Turkey is one of, I think, more developing countries among this list, if you will. But the United States here has the largest gap between rich and poor. And you see Canada partway up the list there. New Zealand, United Kingdom. Anglo-American countries tend to perform worse in these measures. Western Europe and Northern Europe tend to perform better. Another way of looking at this is you take the bottom 20% of the population, and what percentage of the national income do they take? And 20% would be equal, of course. But there's a few countries, and I think the ones you would expect at the 9.5% to 10% range: Denmark, Finland, Norway, Netherlands, Belgium, leading down to, again, the United States. And you see in the middle there, Canada, United Kingdom, New Zealand, not quite as low as the US, but at the bottom. So again, countries that are similar in so many ways are very different in these measures, how they organize themselves, so that these measures come out quite differently. Now, the OECD has a definition of relative income poverty. It's you take the median income, and if you have less than half of the median income, that's called relative poverty, just to have a standardized measure across countries. And this looks pretty much the same as the other graphs that we've been looking at, with Denmark, Finland, Norway, Netherlands at the top, France nearby, and at the bottom again, the United States. And here you see Australia, Canada, again near the bottom. And then economies in trouble. Spain and Greece aren't doing well at all for anybody in hardly any measures recently, of course. Now, as a measure of resources available to a government to do something, right, is the percentage of the GDP that is taken in taxes. Standard, again, OECD measure here. And Denmark and Sweden have been the winners in this category as high tax nations in plain English. Right? And the United States at the bottom at 25%. So it's one's value judgment as to which is good or which is bad. And I think a lot of people say, well, something in between might be a bit better. But the fact is that the more resources a nation has to use for social protection and to equalize other things, the better. But it doesn't guarantee that the country uses it wisely. So I'm not saying high taxes are great, because the taxes may not be used well. It may not make a difference in some of the key things we might care about. But certainly countries with a very small tax take have a hard time doing more. They simply don't have the resources. So 1% change in GDP on this graph, depending on the size of the economy, it can be a couple $2 billion in the smaller countries, and it's many, many tens of billions of dollars in a big economy like the United States. So just a 1% change. So the gap between 25 to 48% is quite astounding. But then you take a related measure. The OECD carefully defines social expenditures now. Almost anything can be called a social expenditure. But this is social spending on meeting some defined need. So they're very careful here. It took them 20 years to get better at it. And the list is familiar, again, with France, Denmark, Sweden, Belgium at the top there. And at the bottom, here you see Canada, United States, Australia, Turkey. Those countries take very little in taxes, and what they do take, even less than the other countries, is spent on meeting social needs. So before I go on further, when we think about diversities and the study we're engaged in here, is there an assumption that a country at the top of the list is going to do better in diversity because they have more money and they're going to do more? Well, having more money, it does allow you to do more. It doesn't mean you're going to allocate it there, of course. And then Canada has been included in the study of EU nations because supposedly we do diversity well, and I think we do certain things well, especially in Toronto. But Canada does not perform well at all compared to Western Europe and Northern European nations on these measures. And then over time, what has been happening, this is where we get into the growth in inequality. The study was just released a couple weeks ago, again by the OECD. And look at the blue line first, this dark blue. Represents 90% of the population of those countries. So from 1975 to 07, there's been income growth, of course, in those countries, all those countries. Where did the income growth go? Well, somehow in Denmark, it went to the 90%, and the 90% of the population got 90% of the increase in the strength of the economy and output of the economy. The United States down at 25%, Canada 30, 35, UK, Australia, New Zealand. This is why the income inequality is growing in almost all nations, but dramatically growing in the Anglo-American nations. You see at the right hand of that of this bar graph here. And then the 1%, when Occupy began, when I heard about it, I said to myself, maybe they got it wrong, because I never looked at the 1% before. I thought maybe it's 5%. They should have had like the 5 and 95, right? Not the 99 and 1. But no, look at this. Again, in the United States, to have almost 50% of the increased economic output go to 1% of the population. Canada a bit better, not by much. UK same, Australia same. And then you hit Western and Northern Europe doing a bit better. When I look at the trend lines in inequality for Scandinavia, Western Europe, Denmark stands out that the 1% have not gained much. Maybe it's 1% more. They're down at 5% or something. In Sweden and other countries, there is greater inequality, but only a small amount compared to the Anglo-American countries. So in the United States today, made the news a few months ago, the 1% take 20% of the national income. So 1% of the income earners in the United States take 20% of the income. This is not talking about wealth yet, annually. That's the most extreme situation. Canada's around 11 or 12%, and then it goes down after that. Now switching to something totally different, and so you get a different distribution, looking at one population group, but youth. Young people, this is a hard economy for anybody in lots of countries, but in particular for youth. And here you have the youth unemployment rate for these countries. And it's just different, right? The countries that have high unemployment for everybody, Spain and Greece, not surprisingly, have very high unemployment for youth. And what is, I think, quite interesting is look at a collection here. Yes, here we have, this is what I want to point out. United Kingdom, France, and Sweden. Very high, frankly, over 20% youth unemployment. Shouldn't they really be with some of those other countries, you know, some lesser number, but the three of them are at very high numbers there. It's just an observation. Now it also happens to be, and it's just an observation, we're not jumping to cause and effect, but we do know about the riots in Paris not too long ago, and more recently the riots in England that broke out. And then I'll be mentioning Sweden a year ago, a little over a year ago, also youth riots and burning of cars and all that. So anyways, that's just my observation there without digging down any further. But I don't have other breakdowns like this yet, but it's interesting to look at how countries differ on this measure. The thing around youth, again, is that it used to be that the elderly, older people, were more in poverty than any other group. So this is an average for all OECD countries. And the light blue line is the mid-1980s, then you go to the mid-1990s up to 2011. And in the mid-1980s, youth were more in unemployment, poverty, but not as much as today. So by the mid-1990s, it jumped up and has stayed there for young people and has gotten a lot better for the older ranges of the population. So I think this is another important trend along with inequality, opportunities for young people. Now there's a literature that's much debated, Varieties of Capitalism it's called, and it has, I think, oversimplifies a lot and tries to impose neoclassical economics onto political science and things like that. But there's something there. I'd like to call it Varieties of Developed Economies to broaden it just from one narrow economy, if you will. But what I've just showed you, Western Europe and Northern Europe pretty much are called coordinated market economies, where people mainly collaborate. Labor, capital, the government work together in some of these countries quite well in organizing things and trying to do better, whereas the Anglo-American countries and some others are liberal market economies where there's way less coordination and way less cooperation and highly competitive. So I'm going to venture a little hypothesis that we could maybe talk about. If you're a newcomer to one of these Western nations that I was just listing here, Canada or any of the diversities nations here, and you're struggling to get by, you need a good job, right? If you have a good job and a good income, you're okay. But how do you get that good job? And then if you don't get that good job, if there is discrimination or exclusion from good occupations, good jobs, because of your skin color or other factors, what do you do? Yeah, those coordinated market economies have lots of social services and social supports, for sure, compared to the liberal market economies. But it seems to me in the liberal market economies, you can be more entrepreneurial and go out and start something without a lot of red tape. And then so many sectors in the economy are not highly regulated with all the red tape and with barriers to entry. So I'm just giving that to you to think about, because in some of the discussion here in this project, I think there's been an assumption that if a country stands out like a Denmark does or a Netherlands or Sweden in all kinds of social benefits, this is just way better for newcomers. But I think that needs to be questioned. And there's more involved than just these big indicators. And so is it the type of economy or other factors? And we can all agree it's more than just the type of economy, but I put here racism, discrimination, segregation, opportunities. Who offers more opportunities to the different or the very different, diverse, if you will, person in a particular society or social system? Because again, I'm here from Canada thinking, we don't do too well on too much. You come to Canada as an immigrant, good luck on housing, right? Good luck on all kinds of things, because we don't provide that. We have 5% of our national housing stock is social housing. It's aging. It's all full. You're not going to get into social housing very easily, except some of the worst housing estates, which have lots of vacancies. And what do you do, right? So I want to mention then Sweden. If Sweden has all these good indicators, this was in May of last year. It didn't make too much of the news, but some. In the United States, the conservative press just loved it, that the social, democracy doesn't work, the welfare state doesn't work, and then you get the racist elements in the United States saying, see that? Even if you give them everything, housing and medical care and everything, they still don't appreciate it or whatever, right? You get that kind of talk. Our colleague Christine here from Paris mentioned to me that she happened to be in Stockholm at that time, central Stockholm though, if you don't know, is just, and it was as if nothing was happening. Right? And this went on for 1 week of youth burning cars in their neighborhoods. They did not go downtown though, and was set off in Husby. I happen to know about this because when I go to different countries, I study how aging housing estates are being improved or upgraded. And Husby was built in the early 70s. It's recently been renovated. I think it's just a lovely place in design and maintenance and regeneration. But a police shot and killed somebody in their home. But the police did not shoot and kill a black youth or immigrant youth. It was a 70-year-old Portuguese immigrant. It's a long story. But then the police told a number of different stories that night about things, and there was evidence right there whether or not the ambulance came and so on and all that. So youth then pent up anger is what was going on in there. Youth feeling they're not going anyplace, and they see their parents not going anyplace. Husby and many of these suburban housing estates were built for Swedes and for newcomer Swedes, but more and more of them over the recent 20 years have become immigrant places of where newcomers live, as opposed to Swedish-born ethnic Swedes, if you will. And then the blame game. Here's a community activist, in effect, saying it's not all about inequality and unemployment and integration. It is about that, but it's not all about that. And she's making 2 points down here at the bottom here. The first is that there has been a broad tendency within and outside Sweden to praise Swedish policies, which have not actually yielded their intended outcomes. Right? So we can have good policies on inclusion, good policies on immigrant settlement, and good policies in trying to include people into good jobs and opportunities, but do they work or not? And then second is the long swept under the carpet issue of racism in Sweden. And that came out a lot in the news then about the police sweeps, police checking papers, and it's pretty easy to distinguish a Swedish-born Swede versus a newcomer Swede for that. In Husby, a community organization, Megaphone, called a unified suburb can never be defeated, right? A variation on the famous A People United, right? So in the United States, in Canada, and I don't know Europe that well, but parts of Europe for sure, suburbs that were built after World War II for the local population are no longer seen as desirable, and people with choice aren't living there, and so they are filled up with newcomers because they're available. And that's what's happening in Canada quite a bit, and lots of American suburbs that used to be all white are now all Hispanic, all black, because there's an aging stock there that other people don't want to live in. And in this case, the suburbs are in Sweden, well serviced by transit. There's a subway stop at most or all of those suburban housing estates, and they're quite well maintained. But still, they're out there as opposed to part of the core of the city. So with that, I'll now switch to drilling down using Toronto as a case study now that you've seen some of those basic indicators. So I'll just show you once again, remember Canada was at 32, that's the red line, and on the Gini index. And when you look at these things, you have to be careful. The blue line represents market income. So when you go to work, this is the distribution of income that the market provides in Canada, the top of the blue line. Our Gini index would be 0.36 if it wasn't for taxes and transfers. So everything I've shown you and what the OECD does very carefully is to use the real lived income of people, which would be income adjusted for taxes and transfers. Now that's how many countries differ. In Denmark might have highly unequal market income, but after taxes and transfers of their version of a welfare state, you saw their numbers performing at the top of some of those good lists in terms of inequality. And so what you see here is we were a more equal society in the 70s and 80s in Canada, and then it took off. The growth of inequality took off in the 90s, and the taxes and transfers no longer covered as much. So inequality was allowed to become worse than it was earlier, where taxes and transfers were doing a bit better job at addressing those gaps. So this is Canada's story. This is the report that was mentioned by Mike, and we're doing this in 6 Canadian metropolitan areas, and as mentioned in Chicago now, looking at how cities have changed over time. So those bar graphs I showed you have to do with the whole nation. That's social. And now this is socio-spatial. Where do those trends live? In what neighborhood, what part of the city? And then over 40 years, how have the cities changed? And this project started with what is called the divided cities literature, emerged in the 1990s. Again, I mentioned Ronald Van Kempen, Peter Marcuse, and others were key people in that body of literature at that time, hypothesizing, having a little bit of evidence that cities were dividing. It wasn't new that we had divided cities, rich and poor areas, but what was new is stronger, more rigid divisions and greater inequality, and this is from a 2000 book there, and this is what we're demonstrating here, has indeed happened. So this map is called the 3 Cities in Toronto map. We did try to give each of the 3 a name. In the literature, the wealthy areas are sometimes called the citadel and things like that, and they're all pejorative, whether it's good or bad or whatever, and we came up with just 1, 2, 3. Okay, there's 3 areas. There's one area going up over time in socioeconomic status, and here we're mapping individual income now as the start of socioeconomic status. And then there are census tracts that have been going down in socioeconomic status over time. So this is a look over that long period of time, updated here to 2010 in this case. And so we have 40% of Toronto's census tracts. Census tracts have about 3,500 people. They're fairly small units, a proxy for neighborhoods. So 40% of the city of Toronto going down over time in socioeconomic status, 25% going up, and the middle city just getting smaller every time. It sort of doesn't matter. It's the average or middle city, but we're losing the middle income group in lots of countries. So what we did was ask, where were the census tracts in 1970 relative to the average income for 1970? Where are they in 2010 relative to the average income for the city in 2010? And that's why it's a map that shows 2 points in time. This presentation will be available to you. That's the same map, but it provides an explanation of how we arrived at the change and all that. Here is a 3D version of that map, how things have changed. So by definition, the blue areas are going up in individual income, but then this is how much each census tract has gone up. Down here, I'll show you shortly, is what used to be inner city poverty. This is the area that's gentrifying in the city. This is always a high income, and this area here was always high income, just that there's more such districts. Then you flip the 3D map over and to see these going down, and they can only go down so far, which is to minimum wage and to welfare rates, which are both barely enough to live on, but that's how far most of them have gone down. And so then the in-between city, in some cases it's going up a little bit and will soon join the blue, and in other cases it's going down and will soon join the brown area on the map. So we're going to end up with 2 geographies, one group very high income, another group very low income, and in Toronto's case, 2 geographies that are pretty much connected. In Canada's other cities, this is happening, but every city is a bit different depending on where rivers are, mountains are, things like that. So they're not necessarily consolidated areas like in Toronto here. Losing its middle income group, it used to have some low income census tracts now. And it's all going up to the highest income group, that 25% of the city. whereas the city number 3 was built for middle and lower middle income people. Here's the middle, dropping right off 1970, 80, 90, 95, 2000. The 1990s in all our measures in Canada is where the greatest change took place. Minimum wage kicked in, deindustrialization was well on its, had pretty much already happened, things like that. So you end up with a whole part of the city that has 30% very low income, again, minimum wage levels, and then 50% low income there. We are, as I mentioned, studying Chicago also. The two cities happen to be about the same size geographically and about the same population. And as you might expect from the US indicators, they do play themselves out in Chicago. Over 50% of Chicago is trending downwards as compared to the 40% here. And then we have 25% trending up, and they have 21% trending up. Some gentrifying areas in addition to the previously sort of posh areas. Chicago is losing population, but black population, and Toronto is gaining population, a diverse population, about 100,000 people per year in the greater Toronto area. Forgot to mention that Toronto is about 2.5 million people, 2.6 million people, and our immediate suburbs are another 2.6 million people. And then there's another 2.5 million, so we're in that 5 to 6 million metropolitan population area. What I'll now show you is flip through change, 40 years of change. This is Toronto in 1970. Lots of people don't realize that, of course, Canada is a nation of immigrants, and in the 50s and 60s, we were receiving lots of immigrants. So in a 4-year period, something like 250 or 60,000, sorry, in a 5-year period, about 250,000 coming in the 1960s. More recently, it's 400,000 in a 5-year period, a recent 5-year period. So our population was in fact a lot smaller back then than it is today. So proportionately, there was even a bit more immigration. It was almost all immigration from Europe. And in particular, the biggest numbers came from Southern Europe, Portugal and Italy and Greece and a number of other countries, some Eastern European countries too. So we had lots of immigration at that time. That's an important thing to remember. But here is your traditional inner city poverty. Here is downtown Toronto. This is the core of Toronto here. And then the east side and the west side, and along the railroad tracks here, low income people lived, and nobody wanted those old Victorian houses on the Victorian streetscape in those days. Jump to 1980, a little more. Remember, this is one point in time. The reddish brown here is low income or very low income. Blue is high or very high income. 1980, a little bit more. 1990, again, there's a sort of a railroad corridor here and some not too nice housing, and a whole lot of social housing built here. This area here, by the way, is our diversity study area in Toronto, sometimes called Jane Finch or the Black Creek area of Toronto, in this part of Toronto up here. Now watch 1990 to the year 2000, because I mentioned how 1990 was a year of, that decade of falling incomes for the majority. And this is the change in the map. All these census tracts, again, low or very low income, and the opposite here, with that middle disappearing on this map. And then here we are at 2010, a little more of the same. Now, these areas up here were built after World War II. They are North American low-density sprawl, assuming the wife stayed at home with 4 or 5 kids, the suburban houses there, you had to have 1 or 2 cars. Now we did build, unlike other North American cities, clusters of high-rises all over. So there's lots of rental housing there in 20-story high-rises because of zoning. And we had metropolitan government, unlike the United States, so it was easy to locate social housing throughout the whole city. So these areas have clusters of social housing and aging rental housing, and then the suburban sprawl. So if you have money, and want to live in Toronto, and if you like downtown living or really fancy house living like around here, you would buy in the blue areas, okay? But if you like suburban living, you like the suburbs, you don't want to buy into a 50-year-old suburb. You're buying into the suburban area around Toronto, where new suburbs are being built and new houses are being built. So these areas are the least desirable areas. They're by no means slums. They're by no means run down in any traditional sense of that. There's simply not much quality there. There's no amenities, if you will. It's highways and wide arterial roads. There's many ways to look at how cities change. And here we have a Gini index, not of people, but of census tracts. And this is a way of measuring the extent to which a city is becoming more and more equal or unequal over time. So on the left side, 1970 to 2010, here is Toronto. And again, the 1990s is the biggest separation, if you will, between census tracts separating themselves out into very low income or very high income and nothing much in between. And it's being played out, you know, in a similar fashion, but at slightly different rates in our other major cities in Canada. Now, Toronto's known for its diversity. We are half white and half non-white now, Toronto. City of, as I said, 2.6 million people. Where does our diversity live? This is the 25% of the city, as I told you, but it's 82% white. 40% of the city lives in city number 3, and it's 1/3 white. And so Toronto's diversity lives in 40% of the city. As I said, city number 2 doesn't matter too much. It gets smaller every year. We can track it from every census getting smaller. So this division is not only income, but it also happens to be ethnocultural and skin color to a large extent too. So very few people in the blue areas have black neighbors, for example. So I asked for this map. We have 500 census tracts. I said to Richard, our data analyst, okay, let's look at the 5% that have the highest black population, the 5% with the fewest. And in purple are the fewest. They have something like 13 black people, not households, people per census tract, again, out of about 3,500 people. And then the gold areas here are the census tracts with the highest percentage of black population. Now on a census form you can declare, you check off if you're black, and you check off all kinds of other ethnicities and all that too. So anyways, what is interesting though about that is that the concentration of now black population versus other forms of diversity, black population alone, Africans, Caribbeans and so on, ranges from 25 to 45%. So that's sort of good news. You know, in the United States, it's 90, 95, 98% black or Hispanic, and white areas are 90, 95, 99% white also in the United States. So we do have this over-concentration of the black population, but nothing like the United States. Again, this is in our study area known as Jane and Finch. It's in those inner suburbs. There's gun violence. Toronto is a very safe city. There's not much crime. It's nothing like the United States. But youth gangs, drug gangs, and often immigrant kids. This is where you have a chance of having your child shot or have random bullets sprayed around. On the positive side, the municipality is playing quite a positive role on diversity. We have lots of refugees who don't have their status clarified yet. There's a movement here called Sanctuary City Movement. It simply says that if you live in the city and the city provides services, it doesn't matter what your status is with the national government. You live here and you need those services. So no city staff asks about your papers or whatever. If you live there and you need some service, that's what that means. And so in so many different ways, the city is doing its best, but municipalities in Canada have very little power and very little independent taxing authority. So finally, what can be done? First off, societies are dividing, some more than others. And the fact is that it's a choice, because I showed you those bar graphs earlier. Some countries are doing a better job at not having the trends I just showed you about Toronto, and some are not doing so well. And this is a Joseph Stiglitz, something pointing out that choices are being made all the time by different countries as to what kind of society you're going to have. Why should we worry about rigid social-spatial divisions? This is the best sentence I've found to answer that question from Richard Wilkinson and his colleagues. It's not a very good city or society if everybody is purely self-interested, thus affiliative, antisocial, more stressful, and all that, as opposed to the opposite. Again, Richard Wilkinson has a nice graph here. His team made an index. These are both good things and bad things. So you want to have a lot of the good things and a lot of the bad things. And this is sort of a summary of all the bar graphs I showed you earlier. This is performing better on these things, and income inequality, having less income inequality is better here. So you see Japan, but over here is all of Western and Northern Europe doing better than, and Canada's on the cusp of that group, and the Anglo-American countries, and then you do have Greece in there, and Portugal. And I have to put the flag up there, because if you look along the line for the United States, you can't find it. It's off the scale. Of performing worse in these things, and we know that from the news, obesity and so on, right? Gun violence, and having, as all the charts I showed you, the highest income inequality. But again, we're here studying diversity. Where is it easier to settle in or make a choice? And as I looked at this earlier today, I said, if I was trying to migrate from someplace, would I choose, what's the probability of migrants, if I have a choice, choosing, say, Sweden or Denmark, or the United States, or even Canada? I'm not sure what the answer would be. I think it might be more the United States and Canada than those countries. And yet, as soon as you land in those countries, you are way better off from day one in a variety of ways. But are the same opportunities open to you? That's what I'm wondering about as I prepared this for you. But anyways, I think there's 4 causes of certainly what's going on in Canada. And the biggest cause is a change in the labor market. And that's what the majority of people work. A minority of people are on income support programs, social assistance or pensions and all that. It's a minority of people there. There have been severe cutbacks in Canada on these things for sure. But this is where we switched from having a living wage and good wages and unionized wages to more and more part-time jobs, minimum wage jobs, and the working poor as another category of low-wage work. So this is a major factor, I think, in what I showed you about Canada and the changes in Canada. Now, the other factor is the most expensive budget item for any household except the very well-off is your house, your rent, or your mortgage. Now, some countries help out a lot in that way. Canada happens not to almost at all. We have no rent supplement program or housing benefit. So this is a major stress as house prices go up. And then something in Canada we don't talk about much, and I don't think in Europe is talked about too much, is discrimination and racism, and not doing much about that. So this is a major factor when you have a non-white population entering either formerly or currently still mainly white population. My project has had this first forum, and we're going to have a couple more like this. So in Toronto, those who care already know about these trends. So given Toronto's growing social-spatial divide that I just showed you, the forum topic was what's racism got to do with it? And we had people in the community who study various things in the sectors of employment, housing, and justice, criminal justice, and so on. We filled up a university town hall, 200 people, with the best discussion of comments, questions, suggestions, and all that. People want to talk about this. Those who feel they're excluded from opportunities in Toronto. So I think racism, discrimination has a lot more to do with a lot of the problems than we might normally talk about or admit to. Now, in terms of gun violence, before a provincial election, it's already some 8 or 9 years ago, in order to get the problem off the political agenda for the government of the day, they, of course, had a commission, right? So then, well, I can't comment on it because the commission is deliberating, right? But we have a 5-volume set called The Review of the Roots of Youth Violence that can be found on the web. I think it's just the best set of studies about youth violence that is happening in many countries. Now, the commissioners went, and as our Chief Justice was one of the commissioners, they went and talked to young people. And they heard about racism. They heard about the way cops treated them and all that. And so after a couple of years, the government not doing anything, I asked people I know who worked for that, and they said bluntly, yeah, the government did not want to talk about racism or discrimination. It's not being talked about. They're not going to talk about it. And the thing sits there as a nice short course in the issue without anything happening. So if nothing changes in Toronto, because we have 40 years of trends on those census tracts, we can project out further. We don't know what year, but we can project out further, straight line. And so we end up with a city that is about 60% low income and about 30% very high income and nothing else, and divided that way. Now, I haven't talked about the outer suburbs, but parts of the outer suburbs have the same trends. Not as dramatic, but they very much have the same trends as the city here. Hope informative, and I hope we have something to talk about. We have our website, neighborhoodchange.ca, where we post all our reports. And I have some great colleagues, geographers will know, Larry Bourne, David Lay, Robert Murdy, Damas Rose, and Montreal Alan Walks, who devised this kind of analysis, and Richard Marinan, our data analyst. On our website, you'll find this report if you care about measures of income inequality and measures of polarization, which is a disappearing middle, right? The pole's growing. Alan Walks has this nice paper here about the different measures, and he comes up with a index of polarization also. So I hope this has been of some interest, and I'll be happy to answer any questions or listen to any comments.
Thank you.
Mike.